Hey class, we're going to get started with our next lecture, which is exercise physiology. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and we will get started with the PowerPoint slides. Okay, so exercise physiology, which we should know the definition of exercise physiology from our kind of first lecture a long time ago about how exercise science or exercise physiology is the study of the kind of scientific analysis of the body in motion. So we're applying a lot of science to human movement and analyzing a lot of different data about the human body. So some objectives for this lecture, we're going to look some key features of this sub-discipline of this physiology of physical activity. We'll look at some research methods used by kinesiologists, but most importantly, we're going to look at how the body responds to physical activity, as well as how some variables affect our physical activity and sport performance. All right, so exercise physiology is the subdiscipline of the biophysical sphere. Like we said a second ago, it is the scientific analysis of the human body in motion. That's exercise science, which is very similar to exercise physiology, which the physiology part goes a little bit deeper into the aspects of the human body. We see that the main part of exphys is looking at the acute responses to physical activity and the changes in response to chronic physical activity. So acutely, what happens when we first start exercising, to what are some adaptations or chronic changes that have occurred in the body that have now taken place. And most of the time, these adaptations make me better at my sport or better at my activity and performance. It combines both biology and chemistry. So XPhys takes principles of biology, and we know biology is the study of human life, and we are life forms. And so we're looking at kind of the different biological changes that occur in the body with exercise, and then also chemistry, because a lot of what happens in our body during exercise involves a lot of reactions. And so we're looking at this like cellular level of chemical reactions that are occurring, especially with our metabolism, and how exercise like changes our metabolism. And how the body responds to physical activity in that sense or in that nature. And so that's kind of the gist of like what XPhys actually is. And so what are some goals of exercise physiology? One of the big ones is looking at improvements in physical performance, as well as improved physical function and performance in an altered environment. If you think, what's an altered environment? It is taking the human body out of like a thermoneutral or just like a controlled condition and putting them in, or like studying the effects of like high altitude on performance, or the effects of heat, or the effects of cold. And so we can alter the environment. Usually in a laboratory setting, we have these different chambers that simulate or mimic a certain environment. And so we can see how the body responds in that way, which is really, really cool. We can look at how exercise and physical activity just improve basic health and fitness. And this is for just like the general population. So just what's the benefit on the human body for doing exercise, as well as how it can treat and prevent diseases. There are several researchers in our department who look at cardiovascular function. So mainly looking at like the vessels, so the vascular system and blood flow, like pre and post exercise. So there are a few professors that look kind of cardiovascular wise. And then, like I said, one of the most important ones is understanding adaptations. And so these are like the acute changes that occur, as well as chronically what happens to the body. What changes have taken place in my body to make me a better runner or a better lifter or a better like skill athlete or whatever your sport is. This little YouTube video right here at the bottom, that link that will be posted on Blackboard, so you can watch that. It's just a general video kind of about exercise physiology. All right, so what are some jobs that you can go into or careers you can go into that if you have a master's or a PhD in exercise physiology as well, most of these require certifications. So to become a personal trainer or an exercise instructor, there are several different organizations that certify these individuals to be able to go out into the field and work with others, either training or teaching group exercise classes. Strength and conditioning professionals usually have a master's degree as well as a certification. There's one called the strength and conditioning specialist, and there's another one called the strength and conditioning coach. And so looking into those is how an individual would get into like work with a sports team. Fitness specialization, this would be specializing in a special population such as elderly, children, pregnant women, or even more serious clinical type conditions such as obesity, stroke patients, cardiovascular disease, disabilities, kind of stuff like that. Corporate fitness, hospital-based wellness. This would usually involve some sort of master's in like a public health degree, as well as a certification kind of for like a health and wellness coach is kind of what we would see there. Clinical exercise physiologist is one of the highest paid professionals in like the exercise physiology realm of careers. These individuals, they have a master's or a PhD in XPhys, and then they also have the clinical exercise physiologist certification. Usually it's through ACSM, American College of Sports Medicine. You can also become a university professor with a master's or a PhD, and you can teach classes. And then you can do research, but you can also go a little bit higher and do research in XPhys for the military or NASA, because these people also want to know how the body responds to different types of really intense training and really intense environments. So there's a lot to do out there. All right, so we're gonna look at some different research methods, and I'll talk about kind of what our professors in our kinesiology department, kind of what we study. So oxygen uptake is probably one of the most common methods of study when looking at like VO2 max and wanting to assess, like it says there, gas volumes. We can measure volume of oxygen consumed and volume of CO2 produced by the body. And this can give us a ratio basically of how much fat versus carbohydrates the body is using based on the amount of oxygen and CO2 produced. We do this by these metabolic carts that are hooked up to these gas masks where we have someone exercising, and then we can measure that. Usually a person who is doing some sort of VO2 test is hooked up with those gas masks and then running on a treadmill or doing some sort of cycle. Those are the ones we have here, treadmills, arm and leg cycles. We don't have a swimming flume, but that is less common to have in departments, but larger research areas do have those areas to measure someone's like swimming, like how fast they're swimming in the water and etc. We do have a body composition lab. One way to measure body comp is by underwater weighing. Again, that one's more or less common now. And then calipers, skin fold calipers are also a little less common due to the error involved. We have a DEXA in this department, and we have a SICA, which is another method that we would assess body composition. The DEXA is the gold standard for assessing bone mineral density and body comp. And then the SICA, it's like a bioelectrical impedance. Electrical current goes through your body, and we can get an assessment of your body fat that way as well. biochemical methods, we do have a blood lab and then we have a muscle biopsy lab here. So collecting blood samples is done by someone who's certified in phlebotomy. So we have one of our researchers is a phlebotomist, and they collect blood samples, and they mainly can look at hormone levels this way. We have someone who is certified in doing muscle biopsies. This helps us to identify muscle fiber type, and we can look kind of at the condition of the muscle fibers in the tissue, look at size, such as hypertrophy. So a lot of things, a lot of data we can get from doing a biopsy. We do have one or two of our researchers who study animal models. We do not have them in our department, but they are located somewhere else on campus. These mammals that are used are usually, they match humans as close as possible. And so we can study their response to a certain condition. And that's how we can get data and try to relate it to the human body. And then we have field work. So field work is taking laboratory equipment that is easy to move, that is effective when taking it out of the lab, and we can conduct research on the field. And when we say on the field or in the field, it would be like going into a PT clinic, or we would go on to the sideline of a game or into practice for a sport. And so it's basically taking equipment outside of the lab and collecting data there. There are advantage and disadvantage of field work, but same thing with laboratory work. And so first I want to ask you, what's the advantage of laboratory work compared to field work? So what I want you to think about is the variables that we're trying to measure. So our advantage of doing laboratory work is we can control the variables as much as we can, like as best as possible. So we have a highly controlled environment inside the lab, whereas when we take our research outside of the lab, variables are less controlled. So if we're outside, we can't control the temperature, the wind, we can't control kind of what's going on around us. If we're in a PT clinic, we can't always control the variables of like other equipment or other people that might affect the study. So that is advantage, is laboratory work is highly controlled. But then flip it and we can look at an advantage of field work compared to laboratory work is field work can sometimes give us like real world results. And when I say real world results, things that you can only measure in the field. So if I wanted to look at hormone levels before soccer players go onto the field to play the game, and if I do a quick blood stick on their finger as they're walking out into the pitch, onto the field, I can get real world adrenaline measures. So I can look at epinephrine, I can look at stress hormones like cortisol, I can look at happy hormones like serotonin and dopamine. And so I can get that real world data, but I can't simulate that in a lab. So certain things that we do in the field, we do get real world examples compared to doing it in a lab. And so that's the difference there. All right, so next discussion is looking at the different systems in the body that are mainly discussed in XPhys. So when I teach XPhys, these are all of the kind of chapters or all of the big topic systems that I discuss. And so what I want you to do is answer this question. What do you think happens to each system during exercise? And so when we start exercising, each of these systems kind of change from rest to the beginning of exercise or during exercise. And so I want you to pause this video and I want you to think for just a second about what happens to each one of those. And then as I go through it, I want you to see if you're right on if you guessed correctly on how the body responds to exercise, okay? So you can pause the video and do that. Okay, so let's go. Energy systems. This is referring to the systems that turn our food that we consume into energy, such as ATP. So these energy systems are going to ramp up. They are going to increase in the rate at which they're producing ATP. So at rest, the mitochondria works like a certain level. And then to exercise, you want to multiply the amount of time, I guess, the amount of energy that the mitochondria produces at rest, and then multiply that by 1 to 200. So it ramps up 1 to 200 times to make that much more ATP for the body during exercise. So the rate at which our body is using fuel to make ATP is increased. Our skeletal muscle system, so not referring to the bones, but the muscles surrounding the bones, what happens to that? So first we see an increased blood flow to the area that is exercising. And so if you're doing like an upper body workout, or if you are running or playing a sport or doing a lower body workout, you'll see that increased blood flow to that area. Hey, dog's coming out, Finn, it's okay. Um, and then the muscles will start to experience contraction. And so the eccentric and the concentric phases of contraction will start occurring. And we call this like the stretch shortening cycle. And the muscles will keep repeating itself as the muscles are contracting during our exercise. The nervous system, we have the brain and the spinal cord. Here's Finley. Nervous system, we have brain and the spinal cord, and the neurons. So what we see is increased activity in the motor cortex first. And so the motor cortex activity will increase in like activation. And then so it'll start becoming more active. This motor cortex is responsible for helping to program and initiate movement. And then this information will travel kind of down the spinal cord, and the neurons will travel to the muscles. So if you didn't already know, the nervous system has control over the skeletal system or the muscular system. So that's why they call it the neuromuscular system. It's because like the brain and the neurons and the spinal cord actually innervate the muscle itself. And so with the nervous system, we see increased neuronal activity, so across the brain, as well as through the spinal cord, as well as innervating and activating our muscle tissue. So that's what happens there. Increased action potentials, nervous impulses, electrical activity from the brain to the spinal cord through the muscles itself. Next, with cardiovascular, heart, vessels, blood. So our heart rate increases. And with the increase in heart rate, that's due to certain hormones. And what's interesting is our movement will trigger certain chemicals to be released, and those chemicals will increase our heart rate. And then our heart beats faster, which pumps more blood. And the purpose of pumping more blood is to get more oxygen to those muscles. So our vessels will dilate. So we have vasodilation to allow more blood to get to the working muscles to deliver that oxygen. And that's why our heart rate increases. Next, respiratory system. Increased activation of the stretch receptors in our lungs, as well as an increase in total activation of the lung tissue. At rest, we only ventilate the basal portion of our lungs. And once we start exercising, we increase activation of the entire lung tissue. So the apical portion of the lungs is increased, and we are consuming more air. So we have increased pulmonary ventilation to get in more oxygen, but also to exhale more CO2, because now with exercise, there's more CO2 being produced by the muscles. And then last, with the endocrine system, with this system, this is just increase in certain hormones. So think of your adrenaline system. So adrenaline, we have increased epinephrine. Stress hormone is cortisol, so increased cortisol. For some people, exercise makes them happy, so we have increased serotonin and dopamine. And then another is increase in endorphins, like there's a hormone called beta endorphin, which helps to relieve pain during exercise. And so this increase in hormones, which basically just helps us to exercise longer and gives us more energy to do so. So very good. Okay, next, what we're doing is looking at these two graphs right here. So when you look at a graph, if the graph is well designed, you should be able to know exactly what the graph is saying based on the data in the y-axis and the x-axis, and then the trend of the line. We should be able to know what it's telling us. And so for this graph on the left, we see heart rate and VO2. And we want to understand, how do we describe that, the trend of the line? And so what I want you to think about is, what's the relationship between the two? That's the question we want to ask ourselves. And in this graph, the relationship, it appears to be a direct linear relationship between heart rate and VO2, which means as the volume of oxygen that we're consuming increases, so does our heart rate, or vice versa. As our heart rate increases, so does the volume of oxygen that we're consuming. And so a direct linear relationship. And we know both of these occur during exercise. So this graph basically says what happens to our heart rate and our VO2 as exercise intensity increases over time. They both increase. This next one looks at a fit versus an unfit person. And we're looking at their heart rate and VO2. So the same two variables. So what we see is, if we look on the x-axis at the bottom at VO2, let's go over to 30. So 30 volume of oxygen consumed, or 30 milliliters per kilogram per minute of oxygen. We see if basically with both individuals, both consuming 30 milliliters per kilogram of oxygen, the unfit person heart rate is higher than the fit person. And this is something you may already be familiar with, is that fit individuals, their heart and their vascular system, their cardiovascular system is more efficient. And with that improved efficiency, it means the heart doesn't have to work as hard. And if the heart doesn't have to work as hard, it doesn't have to beat as fast to get the same amount of blood and oxygen to the body. Whereas the unfit person, their heart rate's higher during exercise and at rest because their heart is less efficient. And so it does have to work harder to get that oxygen to the body. So it has to beat faster to do that. And there are other factors that play a role in heart rate that you will learn in your actual XPhys course that you take. But just to keep it simple, the fit heart is more efficient at rest and exercise, submaximal exercise, and it doesn't have to work as hard. So unfit will always be higher. Now I want you to calculate your heart rate, okay? And so we have resting heart rate chart for men on the left and women on the right. You can look at by age, so pick your age group and then calculate your heart rate. And so if you have an Apple Watch on, you can, or whatever, Garmin, whatever watch you wear, you can look down and get that heart rate. But then you can also count it yourself to see if it's accurate. So you can do a radial pulse. So on the thumb side, you're placing your fingers kind of right here on the thumb side. Place two fingers lightly enough to where you can actually feel the heartbeat. Or you can start here if you're a male at your Adam's apple, or a female just kind of right here in the middle of your trachea, and you can run your fingers right up to about right here, and then you can feel your carotid pulse. So you can get your carotid pulse right here, or you can get your radial pulse. So you count for 15 seconds and then multiply that by 4. So time yourself, like on your watch or your phone, for 15 seconds and count the beats in 15 seconds. And then you can multiply by 4. And that will get you heart rate in a minute. And you can see where you fall. So where your heart rate is. So the lower your heart rate is, the more fit you are. You can see like this good category, excellent athlete, the lower your heart rate is. So yeah, do that and just know, it's just interesting to figure out how efficient your heart is, how fast it beats, etc. All right, next we're gonna talk about sleep. So this slide is about what happens, like the importance of sleep for athletic performance. And then the other side will be what happens when you don't sleep. So performance, we see we're not as fatigued. We have improvements in our force and power output with sleep. We're stronger, we are more powerful. Cognition is improved when we get adequate sleep. Decision-making ability, reaction time is all sound and efficient. When we sleep, this is when our body regenerates our structural repair. So if you look over here at recovery, we see physical and mental recovery occurs during sleep. This is when the body's tissues start to repair and heal itself. And if you look here at anabolic hormones, it's mainly due from increased growth hormone levels. Growth hormone is an anabolic hormone that helps to repair muscle, but also like collagen connective tissue. So from the days wear and tear, the exercise you did, your body needs to recover. And so growth hormone only increases when you sleep, but it does increase when you take a nap as well. And so that will help to repair the body. But if you're not sleeping, it does not increase. Memory consolidation. When we study for something and learn something and then we sleep, it actually helps the everything connect and consolidate to where we can recall that information better, like after we've woken up. But if we don't sleep, we don't have that consolidated information and that really fast recall and memory. And then obviously we have higher immune function and decreased susceptibility to illness and infection. So sleep is really good. How many hours should you get? They say shoot for 8. But y'all are young. And so I'd say more than 8. Because as I get older, you don't get to sleep as much, but college is a really good time for you to be able to sleep. So please get your sleep, because if you don't, this is what happens. You see increased neuromuscular fatigue, which impacts your perception of effort, which means everything you do feels harder than it actually should. So when you are exercising and you're sleep deprived, the workout, the sport you're playing is like your perception of effort. Like you feel more exhausted, you feel tireder than you should. It decreases cognition, attention, focus, your mood. You're probably not very happy if you didn't get a lot of sleep, but you are unable to focus on a task. Your attention span is decreased. It also reduces your recovery. So replenishment of fuel stores like glycogen, decrease in muscle protein synthesis. So after a heavy workout, when you sleep, this is when your muscles repair and get larger and stronger. But if you're not sleeping, it doesn't happen. We see dysregulation in cortisol levels. So your stress hormones become dysregulated and it puts off its circadian rhythm, as well as with testosterone and growth hormone. All these hormones have like a natural response throughout a 24-hour period. And when you're sleep deprived, those hormones balance, like it gets disrupted. The pattern in which it releases gets disrupted as well. And then, so like it says, impaired glucose metabolism. So your body has to work harder and you become fatigued faster, and you run out of energy quicker. And then suppressed immune function. So you're more likely to get sick when you're not sleeping or sleep deprived. And then you're more likely to see increased inflammation, infection, illness, all of that. So yes, please sleep, okay? All right, the last topic is muscle fatigue and muscle cramps and muscle damage and muscle soreness. So first, what is muscle fatigue? So this is when the body is no longer able to maintain a expected level of work that you're trying to maintain. So this decrease in your body's ability to perform work, such as my inability to maintain a certain pace during running, or my inability to continue to perform this many repetitions during my lifting workouts. So it's this onset of fatigue where we can't maintain an expected level of performance, affected by several factors. One of them is acidity that builds up in the body. So acidity builds up and it interferes with the muscle contraction process. And then another is we're depleting fuel sources. So like with aerobic exercise, we're depleting our carbohydrate stores, which is glucose and glycogen, which is needed for endurance performance. And then with resistance training, we see a short-term decrease in our ATP production. So without ATP, our muscles have a hard time contracting. And then another one we see is temperature affects our fatigue. So time to fatigue or time to exhaustion changes based on the temperature outside. Time to exhaustion is shown to be longest around 51 degrees, and time to exhaustion becomes shorter or shortest anytime the temperature is above 70 degrees. Basically saying when you're outside exercising, playing a sport outside, running, you can exercise for a long time. Like your time to exhaustion is extended around 50 degrees. But as that temperature rises, and I don't know exactly what the difference between 50 and 60 degrees is compared to 70. I didn't see that in the data that I was looking at. But we know that once that temperature gets above 70, we start to see an increase in fatigue. One thing we know about certain places is changes in humidity. Some areas, environments are very dry, like where I am in Lubbock, Texas, is very dry, whereas some places are more humid, like in Texas, if you were, say, in the like southern area of Texas, the eastern area around the coast, we see a lot of humidity. The more humid it is, it interferes with the ability of sweat to evaporate. And the evaporation of sweat is the cooling mechanism. So in drier conditions, sweat is able to evaporate, in which you're able to cool your body down. But the more humid it is, the harder it is to stay cool. Next is exercise-associated muscle cramps, which can occur during high heat. It's associated or localized to overworked muscles. So when muscles are already sore, they're already tired, that's usually when the muscle can start to cramp up. One cause of cramps is heat, but another one is lack of electrolytes and hydration. So not enough electrolytes, not enough water in your body. And the science behind the electrolytes, which electrolytes are sodium and potassium. And with an imbalance in sodium and potassium, those are the two ions that are transported or transmitted during the action potential. It's like the passing of sodium and potassium back and forth across the neuron as the action potential is traveling to activate muscle. And so somehow this interferes with the ability for signals to be transmitted correctly. And so we'll see signals to activate muscle occur so rapidly at that muscle tissue that the muscle cramps up and it won't let go. And so that's what when we talk about a cramp, we're talking about the muscle cramps up and it won't release. How do we treat this? Stretch. We want to stretch the muscle out, because if we stretch the muscle out, now the signals that are trying to activate that muscle, they now have to travel further across the stretched muscle tissue. And so it can decrease like that firing of those electrical signals to the muscle. And so it can reduce the cramp. So the stretching, holding that stretch position, and then refueling with some sort of sports drink, electrolytes, to make sure that we have enough in our system so it doesn't happen again. And then last is muscle soreness. So muscle soreness results from exhaustive, high intensity exercise, especially performed for the first time. So it's like doing a new workout. So if you're doing like repeat sprints for the first time, if you are training a certain muscle group or doing a new lift or a new exercise, that can affect how the muscles respond. So first, we have acute soreness. This acute soreness occurs during or immediately after exercise, and this is usually a buildup of lactic acid or lactate in the muscles, and we want to be able to clear this lactate out. Another is buildup of hydrogen ions. This comes from the breakdown of ATP as we're using it for energy. Hydrogen ions are like the byproduct of ATP combustion. And then, like I said, lactate is just a product that's produced in our metabolism as we're trying to make ATP. So once we clear that out of our system, usually that acute soreness goes away. Delayed onset muscle soreness, also called DOMS, usually occurs 24 to 48 hours after a really heavy eccentric workout with a lot of muscle lengthening because we're producing these little micro tears inside the muscle. So these micro tears are painful. And then we've also activated our nociceptors, which are our pain receptors. And this causes like soreness to the touch or as we are moving, and makes it really hard to do normal functions when we have this delayed onset muscle soreness. So last questions are, can anything be done pre-exercise to minimize DOMS? And then what can be done post-exercise to minimize DOMS? So you can pause this video and think about these last two questions and then see if you are correct. And so one thing we want to understand is I have this word minimize here because we can't prevent DOMS. It just can't be prevented, but we can minimize it and we can lessen the severity of it. The first question, what can we do before our workout, is any sort of warm-up stretching, and we call this muscle acclimation. We want to acclimate the muscle to the stress that it's about to experience during the primary workout. And so we can do similar movement patterns, similar activities in the warm-up that mimic like the sport we're going to play or the workout we're about to do. And so that helps to minimize it. Post-exercise, there's a lot of things that can be done. We want to make sure we drink lots of water after the workout. We also want to consume protein amino acids after the workout to help repair any damaged muscle tissue. And then we also want to consume carbohydrates because this helps to also give us more energy when our muscles are sore. We want to rest because our muscles will heal better if we're resting. And then during our rest, we can do some sort of active recovery, which is like stretching and foam rolling and doing kind of light activity like walking to kind of help with blood flow. And that increase in blood flow will also help to heal the muscle. There are lots of supplements that are that have been shown to help with DOMS. And so lots of different supplements you can look into for that, but those are kind of the main ones that I talked about to help post-exercise. Okay. All right. Well, that is it for the lecture. So thank you for listening and watching, paying attention. And that's kind of all I have for you. We don't really have anything for this lecture that you have to do specifically. So just make sure to look at the syllabus and the schedule and make sure you're up to date with everything that's going on. And if you watch that weekly intro video, you will kind of see what other tasks you have to do besides watching this video. All right. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you later.